They thought it ended with a sale, a black man outbidding drunk white men for a bruised white girl in a sun-scorched town square. But what they didn't see was the revolution hidden in that moment. What began as an act of defiance would unravel a conspiracy, expose the town's highest offices, and transform a girl sold like livestock into a symbol of justice. Because sometimes the most dangerous people aren't the loudest. They're the ones who've been silent too long. And in Lakewood Springs, silence was about to become a weapon no one saw coming. But first, leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. It was June, and the heat had turned the town square into a skillet. Dust curled around boots, flies hovered like they owned the place, and folks gathered not out of support but out of habit, same way they'd slow down for a car wreck. The sheriff, standing on a makeshift platform, raised his voice as if trying to add dignity to something rotten. "Healthy, obedient, 19, he declared, gesturing toward the girl who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Or nowhere at all. Sarah Collins didn't move, didn't flinch. A bruise marked her cheekbone like a brand. Her eyes fixed to the dirt beneath her, as if she'd learned the hard way that looking up only brought more pain. The first bid came from Frank Holloway, owner of the town tavern and supplier of its meanest drunks. He shouted $25, 0 cents, with a grin that dripped filth. Then came Walter Schmidt, $30, 0 cents, slurred with the casual violence of a man used to breaking things he didn't pay for. At the back of the crowd stood Isaiah Montgomery, a black landowner and widower who knew what it felt like to watch the world pretend your pain wasn't worth a glance. He had seed money in his pocket, money meant to bring his fields back to life after the drought. But when he saw the way Sarah stood, shoulders squared in defeat, eyes hollow, something shifted in him. $50, 0 cents, he said, and the square froze. Every head turned like marionettes on a shared string. The sheriff blinked. Holloway spat. Schmidt cursed under his breath. But Isaiah didn't back down. When Sarah's father, more skeleton than man, tried to raise the bid again, Isaiah didn't flinch. He stepped forward, pulled out gold coins, and laid them down like a challenge. 70, he said, his voice low but steady. The sheriff hesitated, caught between town tradition and federal law. The law says any free man can bid. Isaiah added, "Unless you're ready to explain to a judge why that doesn't apply to me." And that was that. "Sold," the sheriff muttered, banging his gavel with the enthusiasm of a man slamming a coffin shut. As the crowd erupted in murmurs and snarls, Isaiah walked toward the platform. Sarah stepped down slowly, as if expecting chains instead of freedom. Up close, she looked smaller, more breakable. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Collins." "I'm Isaiah Montgomery," he said. She met his eyes just once. "I know who you are," she replied. They began walking toward his wagon, the crowd splitting like bitter water. No one noticed the glint of metal she slipped back into her shoe. No one saw the figure watching from the general store's shadow. And no one, not even Isaiah, knew that what he had just purchased was not a girl. It was a fuse. The wagon creaked beneath them as it rumbled away from Lakewood Springs, each turn of the wheels pressing the silence tighter. Sarah sat rigid on the far edge of the bench, arms crossed tightly, eyes scanning the trees as though the branches themselves might reach for her. Isaiah held the reins with practiced calm, saying nothing. He had no interest in forcing conversation, no energy for anything hollow. Behind them, the town faded into a smear of dust and heat, but its words still rang in their ears. Mockery, outrage, warnings whispered through clenched teeth. Isaiah heard them like echoes in a long hallway he'd walked too many times before. Sarah heard them like fresh wounds reopening. Her hand drifted to her shoe, not for comfort, but for the cool reassurance of the metal hidden there. It wasn't a weapon, not yet. It was a promise she hadn't decided to keep or break, and it was proof she had her own plan, one that didn't include trust or hope. When they arrived at the cabin, the last light of day hung low, like it was reluctant to see what came next. The house stood among dry fields and a fringe of oak trees, nothing fancy but intact. It didn't look abandoned, and it didn't look defeated. There was a small barn, a weathered fence, and a crooked well with a rope that looked freshly replaced. Sarah expected broken windows, collapsed porches, some evidence of despair, but the place was clean, swept, cared for. The wood had been patched, the garden, though thirsty, had been weeded. A single lamp flickered through the window, already lit as if expecting company. It hit her then. This wasn't the home of a man who gave up. This was the house of someone who refused to surrender, even when surrender might have been easier. Isaiah stepped down and gestured toward the door. "There's a room in the back. It was my son's," he said. "It locks from the inside." That made her pause. "Your son?" she asked without looking at him. "Jacob," he said, voice flat. "Died with his mother. Pneumonia. 2 winters ago." Sarah's eyes flicked to the garden. There were no flowers, just soil, cracked and stubborn. But now it all made sense. The silence, the discipline, the untouched room. She said nothing as she climbed down from the wagon, staying a good few paces behind him. Inside, the furniture was minimal but polished, the books lined perfectly on makeshift shelves. It wasn't warm, exactly, but it wasn't cold either. It was the kind of place that whispered, "I still believe something can grow here, even if the world doesn't." Later, over a quiet meal, she finally spoke. "Why?" Her voice barely crossed the table. "Why did you bid?" Isaiah didn't look up from his plate. "Because I know what it's like to be sold," he said, then added almost as an afterthought, "without ever being touched." She blinked at that. A strange answer, but it landed. Because she did too. Not every wound bleeds. Not every chain makes noise. They sat in the quiet that followed, not because there was nothing left to say, but because sometimes silence is the only language that understands pain without asking for explanation. Later that night, as the wind rustled low through the brittle trees, Isaiah spoke again, this time from the doorway as Sarah stood near the locked window. "You plan to run tonight," he said, not accusingly, but like someone stating a weather report. "I don't blame you." She didn't answer. "But if you go east, there are bounty hunters patrolling the ridge. The mayor hired them last week after 3 men escaped from Sullivan's plantation. They don't ask questions, and they don't care about legality." He took a breath. "I'm not keeping you here. I'm telling you what waits if you leave without knowing the woods." Sarah turned, half lit by moonlight, lips parted, but no words came out. "There are wolves out there," Isaiah said, "wolves that don't need permission to devour you. They don't ask for chains. They just assume you're wearing them." And with that, he left her alone, the door unlocked. In the dark, Sarah sat on the edge of the small bed. Her fingers slipped down into her shoe and pulled out the key. Ornate, old, heavy in ways that had nothing to do with metal. She rolled it between her palms like a secret prayer. A flicker of memory returned. Her father's office, thick with cigar smoke, his voice low and mean. "No one reads that book unless I'm dead." She hadn't read it, but she'd listened. He'd listened from the stairwell while names were named and dates scribbled and land quietly bought up like the whole county was just a board game. The key wasn't just escape. It was leverage. Insurance. Maybe even justice, if she could stay alive long enough to use it. Her fingers clenched around it. She didn't cry. She hadn't in years. By morning, the cabin was quiet. The door was ajar. Isaiah was nowhere in sight. Her boots touched the floor lightly, cautiously. She opened the door wider, half expecting him to be waiting outside, but no. Just the sun rising slow and indifferent, painting the edge of the horizon in orange dust. Through the window she saw him in the garden, bent over the cracked soil, pouring water from the well into dead roots, like he hadn't figured out the plants were past saving. She watched him for a long moment, He didn't look up. He wasn't waiting for gratitude, wasn't watching for betrayal. He was just trying. A man who still watered the dead ground believed in something stronger than escape. And for the first time, Sarah didn't step through the open door. She stepped away from it. The horses came just before noon, their hooves kicking up bitter dust as they trotted toward the cabin with a confidence that only ever belonged to men who'd never been told no. 3 riders, one puffing his chest, another squinting like he was sizing up livestock, and the third smiling too wide to be honest. Frank Holloway had the reins loosely wrapped around fingers that once curled into fists faster than a thought. Walter Schmidt rode beside him, posture crooked, his shirt stained with sweat and something sour. And then there was the man in the middle, tall, clean-shaven, sharp as a signed decree. Judge Emery Davis, the new county judge. His coat was black, his boots polished, and his smile the kind that carved instead of comforted. Isaiah stepped outside without a word, standing beneath the slanted porch roof like a man who'd been through storms worse than weather. He didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for the shotgun leaning inside the door. He didn't need to. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he said plainly, eyes landing last on Davis. "You lose your map or just looking for trouble?" Holloway chuckled like a snake, hissing. "Oh, we're just out inspecting county properties," he said. Too friendly. Davis nodded solemnly. "Keeping things up to date, productive lands, responsible owners, that sort of thing." Isaiah crossed his arms. "Funny how that never required a judge and 2 sidearms before." His tone was quiet but laced with iron. "Seems like a lot of weight for just a courtesy visit." Schmidt spat near the well, then grinned. "Some folks forget the land's not theirs forever, especially when they're not using it right." Isaiah's reply cut through like a gavel slamming wood. "You want to talk law, talk, but don't come preaching rules dressed up as threats." It didn't take long for the truth to reveal itself. Davis removed his gloves slowly, theatrically. "Under the county's new suitability ordinance, any land deemed unproductive may be subject to reassignment for the betterment of the township." Holloway nodded like a preacher beside his pulpit. "And from what I see, this place ain't exactly bursting with bounty." Isaiah didn't blink. "Unproductive to you doesn't mean unworthy. It means unclaimed by your kind." Davis kept smiling. "It's just policy, Mr. Montgomery. No need to take it personally." Isaiah stepped off the porch. "It's not what's on the land, Judge. It's what's beneath it, or what's coming through it, that has you here." That stopped them, just for a moment. Just long enough for them to know he knew. From inside the cabin, Sarah pressed herself behind the curtain, heart tight, breath slow. She hadn't seen the judge before, but she recognized the tone. Calculated civility wrapped around theft. Holloway and Schmidt didn't scare her. They were blunt instruments, drunk on their own cruelty. But Davis? He was different. He smiled while he set things on fire. She didn't need to hear every word. They were loud enough, proud enough. But the message rang clear. These weren't just men with power. They were men with a plan. Her father's kind of plan. These men weren't drunk with power. They were accountants of greed, calculating how many acres they needed to control the future. And Isaiah's land, worthless to the blind, sat right on the path of something big. Something that could turn influence into empire. The sound of wheels came next, softer but sharper. Ruth Wilkins' covered wagon rolled up from the west trail, pulled by a mule more dignified than most men in town. She stepped down before it stopped moving, her shawl flapping like a flag of defiance. Middle-aged, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed. She moved like someone used to delivering babies and bad news in the same breath. "Visitors?" she asked, glancing toward the 3 men still on horseback. Isaiah only nodded. The judge tipped his hat with calculated charm. "Miss Wilkins," he said. "You're looking well." Ruth's smile was razor thin. "And you're looking for something that ain't yours." The men didn't stay much longer. They'd made their point, or thought they had. As they rode off, Ruth watched until the last tail disappeared into the dust. Then she turned to Sarah. "How bad?" she asked. Sarah didn't lie, but she didn't speak either. Ruth touched her chin gently, turning her face to the side, examining the fading bruise. "In a town where everyone watches, being invisible is a blessing," she said. "Until it isn't." Inside, over cornbread and coffee that tasted like grit and gumption, Isaiah sat at the table and looked at Sarah like a man flipping through a book he hadn't been told was valuable. "What exactly do you know?" he asked, not unkindly. Sarah didn't meet his eyes. "Not much," she said. "Just rumors." Ruth didn't flinch. "Try again." Silence stretched until it snapped. "I heard things," Sarah said, jaw clenched. "My father, the mayor, the judge. There's a book. Red leather, locked drawer, names, dates, land purchases, and something about the railroad line." Isaiah leaned forward, hands folded. "The one that's supposed to bypass this county?" Sarah nodded. "Unless certain properties change hands first." Her voice cracked just once. "They said it had to look legal, clean. So no one from Boston would suspect." Isaiah's voice was low but sharp. "This land isn't worthless, it's a feud." And now it was lit. They didn't hold hands. They didn't swear oaths. But something passed between the three of them in that room, more binding than blood. Isaiah, who had nothing left to lose but his land and dignity. Ruth, who had delivered generations of babies only to see them grow up into a world designed to crush them. And Sarah, broken but not beaten, who had memorized the lies of powerful men and survived long enough to know the difference between silence and surrender. They didn't plan out loud, they didn't shout, but when they cleared the table, each of them knew the war had already started. Not with guns, not with fire, but with secrets, memory, and the quiet fury of those who had finally had enough. The resistance began not in the streets, but in the silence between sentences, in the glances, in the waiting, in the knowing. The kind of resistance that doesn't announce itself, but always arrives right on time. The rain came like judgment, fast, loud, relentless, the kind of storm that didn't knock politely but kicked the door off its hinges. Sarah moved through it like a ghost stitched to the wind, her cloak soaked and heavy but not slowing her down. Each drop that fell masked her presence. Each clap of thunder erased the sound of her steps. The streets of Lakewood Springs were nearly empty, windows shuttered, doors barred, as if the town itself had something to hide, and maybe it did. She moved past the general store, the tavern, the church, until she reached the squat brick structure of the town hall, its flag drooping, its windows blind. The key in her hand felt warmer than the rain. Metal didn't hold heat, not like that. But maybe it held memory. Maybe it knew this was its moment. She slipped inside, the storm cloaking her like truth cloaks itself in silence. Rain hid the sins of the town as well as it hid her footsteps. The door to her father's office opened with a whisper and a click. The room smelled like paper and power, ink, dust, and the faint hint of whiskey that still clung to the armrests of his leather chair. She went straight to the desk, to the locked drawer she'd watched him open so many nights while men whispered around her like she was furniture. The key turned with a dull snap, and there it was. The red book. Its cover was scuffed, its spine worn, but its pages were crisp, organized, damning. Names she knew, dates she remembered, properties reassigned, votes bought, maps redrawn. A quiet war fought on parchment. What stunned her wasn't just the detail, it was the precision. The ugliness of it all was neat, measured, signed. She held it in her hands like it was fire, burning not from heat, but from the weight of what it exposed. Truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be written in ink no one expects you to read. Cross town, Isaiah entered the telegraph office, drenched to the bone, water running off his coat like sweat off a preacher mid-sermon. Jenkins, the operator, didn't ask questions. He just nodded and stepped aside, closing the back door as if shielding the world from what was about to be said. Isaiah sat in front of the machine, fingers cracking like old wood as he began to type. To Boston, to a professor named Benson, to a journalist named Briggs. to a federal officer who'd once shaken his hand and whispered, "If you ever need a door kicked open, I know the hinges." The message was short, the attachments longer. He had the proof, he had the signatures, he had the story. "They used ink to steal what we bled to earn," he wrote. "We're done bleeding." The wire hissed, sparked, carried his words down a line that would crack like lightning across state lines. He left the office without a word, but the storm didn't follow him. It had already done its work. By dawn, the rain had washed the streets clean, but not clean enough. People stepped outside with coffee mugs in hand and found papers nailed to doorposts, tacked to the courthouse, fluttering on the side of the church like a second gospel. The red book had been copied, the pages reproduced, the names preserved in ink and made public. The guilty weren't hidden anymore. They were posted. Names stared back like ghosts caught mid-crime. Marshall, Davis, Schmidt, Holloway, and others. Quiet names, known names. The kind of names you didn't question because they sat at the front of the church and donated to the 4th of July fund. People read while the morning baked the streets dry, and you could feel it. That eerie stillness that comes right before something breaks. What's written in red ink was signed in stolen land and broken trust. At Holloway's Tavern, the mayor slammed a mug on the table hard enough to crack it. "Who did this?" he hissed. "You were supposed to have that book locked." Judge Davis's face was pale, lips trembling around his morning cigarette. "No one else had the key but you," he said. Unless she..." Marshall turned sharply. "That girl?" Schmidt leaned against the wall, arms crossed, chewing the inside of his cheek like it owed him something. "Montgomery's behind this," he muttered. "I told you we shouldn't have let him be quiet so long." Davis barked a laugh that didn't quite land. "You don't let men like him be quiet, you ignore them until it's too late." Outside, the buzz was growing. You could feel the town shift. Not violently, not yet, but curiously. People weren't asking if it was true. They were asking what else they didn't know. A whisper can crack a dam if enough people lean in to hear it. And then came the part none of them could stop. Sarah stepped onto the church steps as the bells rang 10. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just stood there, holding the original red book, arms steady, face calm. The wind tugged at her skirt, but not her spine. Behind her, Isaiah stood like a mountain, Ruth to one side like a shield. They didn't need to say anything. The papers said enough. But Sarah did speak, just once. "This town belongs to the people," she said, "not the ones who sold it behind closed doors." Her voice didn't waver. She didn't need to be loud. The truth was loud enough. The revolution wasn't in the shouting. It was in the standing, and Lakewood Springs had just seen the ground move. The street filled before noon. No one had called a meeting, but people came anyway. Word had spread like dry fire on brittle grass. Federal boots stepped onto Lakewood Springs dirt with purpose, and the crowd followed, buzzing with something between dread and hope. At the center stood Mayor Marshall, sweat staining the rim of his collar despite the morning's cool. The federal officer held the red book in one hand and a stack of wired confirmations in the other. He wasn't loud, but he didn't need to be. "Mayor," he said, voice level, "would you care to explain why your signature appears on falsified deeds for 7 properties, including land you claimed wasn't fit for farming but now sits on the proposed railroad line?" Marshall's mouth opened, then closed. I was misled?" A woman in the crowd scoffed. A man muttered, "Not for 10 years you weren't." The officer pressed forward. "When liars are cornered by their own signatures, even their silence screams." Marshall had nothing left to say, and for the first time in his reign, no one rushed in to speak for him. Before the weight of that silence could settle, Judge Davis stepped forward, trying to reclaim the air. "Let's not forget that accusations are not convictions," he said smoothly, "and many of us were simply following procedures." The journalist from Boston cut him off. "Which procedures, Judge? The ones you followed after being disbarred in Ohio for judicial fraud, or the ones you used to seize land under false valuations while posing as a federal appointee?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Davis turned pale. The the practiced charm melting off his face like wax near a flame. He stammered something about forged documents, but the sheriff didn't wait. He stepped forward and placed Davis under arrest mid-sentence. Frank Holloway, standing nearby, tried to slink away unnoticed, but someone pointed. He was in on it too. Cornered, Holloway raised both hands and mumbled, "It wasn't supposed to go this far," but it had. And the town, once so eager to look away, was finally starting to see. That's when Sarah stepped forward, eyes fixed on a man near the edge of the crowd. Her father. Mr. Collins stood stiff, arms crossed like he could still control the ground under his boots. "You sold me," she said, and her voice didn't waver. "You sold me like you sold this town, a piece at a time, cheaply." His face twisted, not with shame but fury. "You were never worth the air you breathed," he snarled. "You were a mistake. Your mother knew it. That's why she ran." Sarah didn't flinch. Isaiah moved beside her, not shielding, just present, solid, calm. "Every person in this square is worth exactly the same," Isaiah said. "You can't auction away dignity, you can only bury it under lies until someone digs it up." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded with understanding, with grief, with the unbearable sound of a spell breaking. The sheriff held the red book in his hands now, thumb tracing its spine like it was scripture. Ruth stepped forward and looked him in the eye. "This isn't just evidence," she said. "This is our new declaration, signed not in ink, but in truth, in risk, in resolve." The sheriff nodded and placed the book into the evidence sack gently, like it was something sacred. For the first time in a generation, the law wasn't just a tool for the powerful, it was finally weighing both sides of the scale. People who once crossed the street to avoid Isaiah now looked at him like he was something out of a parable. Men who'd called him boy under their breath were suddenly silent. Women who'd whispered rumors about the girl in his house now looked at Sarah with something close to reverence. The same people who stood by when Holloway spit on his name were now the ones applauding his silence. They didn't cheer because they were noble, they cheered because they saw themselves in the fall. The truth didn't just expose the guilty, it revealed everyone's reflection. That was the miracle and the cost, because now no one could pretend they didn't know. There was no parade, no fireworks, no public speech, just quiet movement. Jenkins tapped out new wires from the telegraph office. The railroad representative asked Isaiah to walk the property line again, this time with a contract in hand. The new mayor, elected after a fast and fierce special vote, visited Ruth that evening with questions about reform. People didn't celebrate. They worked. They whispered less and asked more. But justice wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was slow, deliberate, thorough, and for the first time, it was real. 6 months passed, and Lakewood Springs no longer looked like the place where a girl had been sold under a sun that didn't blink. The railroad came early, cutting across Isaiah's land like a ribbon drawn with intention instead of theft. His cabin stood firm, but now it shared space with new structures. A barn rebuilt, a small schoolhouse born from planks donated by neighbors who once held grudges in their palms like coins. Where vultures once circled, now children ran, barefoot, laughing, unafraid. The fields once starved of hope bore tomatoes, beans, and joy. The town square was no longer a stage for humiliation. It was a place where ideas were passed like bread at Sunday supper. Sarah stood in front of a mismatched row of desks under the wide arms of an oak tree, her voice steady, her eyes bright. Black children, white children, immigrant children, learning side by side as if someone had finally rewritten the rules of gravity. Her scar was still there, a pale line under her cheekbone that caught the light when she smiled and made the smile mean more. The girl who was sold now sold knowledge, without price, without fear, and when the children misbehaved, they didn't see rage in her face, they saw patience. They saw someone who had learned what power really looked like, not in punishment, but in protection. "Why do we read the law out loud?" she asked one afternoon. A boy in patched overalls raised his hand. "So no one can pretend they didn't hear it," he said. Sarah nodded. Exactly. That's how justice grows, not in silence, but in understanding. The town's old order had crumbled like dry leaves in wind. Frank Holloway had skipped town before creditors could bury him in debt. Last anyone heard, he was loading crates on a riverboat with no name. Judge Davis had been extradited to Ohio, shackled in shame, his name removed from every official document he ever touched. Mayor Marshall? Convicted. Gone. Forgotten in the way only dangerous men can be when truth overtakes fear. And Isaiah Montgomery now had a seat at the Regional Development Council. Men who once refused to shake his hand now waited on his words like weather forecasts. When railroad executives visited, they didn't ask him to move. They asked where he thought the station should go. What used to be a threat to their plan had become the blueprint for something better. The school grew fast. What began with Sarah and 3 children under a tree turned into a real building with a bell and a blackboard. Isaiah built it with his own hands, planks he sanded until they shone like stained glass. Ruth Wilkins served on the town council now, the only woman over 60 who could still outtalk a room full of politicians and still deliver a baby before lunch. Sheriff Jensen stayed, redeemed by quiet actions, not loud apologies. He volunteered at the school, sometimes teaching history, sometimes just sitting in the back, watching. The town's heartbeat changed, slower, steadier. People planted more than crops. They planted trust. The long arc did bend, not because of speeches, but because someone dared to stay when it would have been easier to leave. One evening, Sarah and Isaiah stood on a hill just above the new school, watching the lights flicker on below. The town glowed softer now, like it had finally taken a deep breath. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, the air cool and forgiving. "We weren't rebels," she said softly, almost like she was reminding herself. "We were seeds." Isaiah smiled, tools still in his hands, dirt still under his nails. "Revolutions don't always begin with fire," he said. "Sometimes they begin with water poured on cracked soil." They watched in silence, not because there was nothing left to say, but because some victories speak best without noise. And when the first train of the season rolled into the Lakewood Springs station, now officially named Montgomery Crossing, no one gave speeches. Children waved from the platform. Old men nodded in respect. The conductor tipped his hat, not to a title, but to a legacy. And Isaiah Montgomery, standing at the edge of the crowd, finally turned to speak, not to the town, but to the ones listening now, far beyond the tracks and dirt. "The real revolution isn't tearing down walls," he said. "It's building bridges where they never imagined one could stand." Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have another incredible story and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts.